for the Idaho Commission for Libraries. We are recording this webinar so that others can view it at a later date. Those that registered for this webinar will receive a link to a recording in an email. We've muted all participants and we encourage you to use the chat box either for technology troubleshooting or for questions for the speaker. And on behalf of the Idaho Commission for Libraries and our funding partner, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we'd like to welcome you today, and I'm going to hand this off to Jennifer Redford to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Jennifer Redford. I'm a youth services consultant at the Idaho Commission for Libraries. And ever since I started in this role about 1.5 years ago, I've been lucky enough to partner with the Idaho Children's Trust Fund and work together with them on ways that libraries can help strengthen families in their communities. As I'm sure all of you are aware, right now, people in Idaho are facing just trauma of historic proportions. So many people in our community have lost their jobs. They are quarantined at home. Some of them are able to leave their houses for whatever reason. Childcare may or may not be available to them. There's just a lot of pressure being put on the families in the communities that you serve. And I know that as library workers, all of you know that you play a role in helping those families access resources and information that can drastically improve their lives. Taryn is here today to talk to you about adverse childhood experiences and ways to mitigate their effects or eliminate them entirely. This is really important information for all of you to have as you are moving forward, thinking about ways that you can serve your communities, particularly those families in your communities who are struggling at the moment. This is the first of 2 webinars that we're doing. We're doing another one on Tuesday at 1 o'clock on building positive experiences, and I hope you'll join us for that one as well. Also, on the advertisements for this webinar, we had a link to a video that Taryn had previously done about brain development that I think will be interesting for all of you too. So as we're moving forward with this trauma-informed series, Taryn and I will also be working on coming up with lists of resources that you can use in your own communities to help help families who might need assistance. And we'll talk more about that. You'll hear more about that later this month. So I'm going to turn it over to Taryn and let her get started with the content for today. And I really want to thank all of you for being here and for all that you do for the families in your communities.
All right, thank you, everyone. You can hear me okay, Jen? All right. So first of all, apologies. I couldn't quite figure out how to do the slideshow while sharing my screen the right way, so you're all looking at the edited version, but I minimized the thumbnail, so we should be good from here. So yeah, I've been working, I'm Taryn Yates with the Idaho Children's Trust Fund. I've been working with Jennifer and some other folks over at the Commission for Libraries for a while now, and I'm really excited about the movement of libraries to see themselves more as this community resource, and the desire for people who work at libraries and serve their communities to become more trauma informed, and part of that is learning about ACEs. So let's get started. Oops. Okay, sorry. So let's go over some learning targets for the next hour. The first one is just a brief introduction into the Hope Conquers ACEs initiative that coming out of the Idaho Children's Trust Fund with our partners, to learn the basics of the adverse childhood experiences, to understand how ACEs affect behavior and physical health, and to learn the 5 protective factors of the Strengthening Families framework and how to apply them, and to have a discussion on how libraries promote protective factors. Now, I'm used to doing this in person. I'm an in-person person, so it's a little weird for me to be just talking at screen. So feel free, if you have a question, to pop it up in the chat, and Jen will be monitoring for those sorts of things as I'm talking. So if I'm going too fast, or if something is not making sense to you, definitely point it out. I'm happy to go back. All right, this is just a little bit about me. Like they said, I'm the grant manager planner for the Idaho Children's Trust Fund. Here's some basic information if you want to get a hold of me later. There's my email. The Idaho Children's Trust Fund.org is our website. We're also on Facebook. We are the state affiliate of Prevent Child Abuse America, so we also go by we're co-branded as the Prevent Child Abuse Idaho. Maybe you see our pinwheels around. We didn't have quite the pinwheels we used to. Child Abuse Prevention Month was April, and it looked a lot different with all this COVID going around. There's me and my 2 boys who are older now. So it's been interesting knowing what I know and also being the mother of 2 rather active and at times challenging little people. All right, just a brief explanation of the Hope Conquers ACEs initiative. So when we talk about hope, we talk about little h hope and big H hope. And when we talk about little h hope, of course, we're talking about that beautiful word that just means you're future oriented. You believe that things are going to get better. You can see past difficulty. People with hope can see past whatever's going on in their present moment that's challenging for them to a better day. People in the field say hope is a hallmark of resilience, and we believe that very much. The hope with the big H is based on a resource paper that was called Health Outcomes from Positive Experiences by a pediatrician named Dr. Robert Sege, S-E-G-E, if you want to look up the paper. And it was really the adverse childhood experiences has been a thing for a while now, although it's just recently starting to pick up steam. But only recently have we started looking at the flip side and looking at how positive experiences are very powerful in mitigating some of the challenges that can come with negative experiences and how it can prevent child maltreatment to begin with. So we have a group of about 30 trainers all over the state that they're from all different organizations, different disciplines. We have librarians. One of our trainers is a librarian. Because we believe that libraries are just natural allies for family strengthening. We have teachers in our community of practice, a lot of social workers, therapists. So we have this group of trainers, and we go into communities and train people on the trauma-informed approach, on adverse childhood experiences, on protective factors, and how to really start implementing some of this knowledge and practices and embed it into the work that you're already doing to help you better serve your families. So that's what Hope Conquers ACEs is all about, and we are so happy to be partnering with the libraries on it. All right. So first I want to start out, you guys are librarians, you should appreciate this. We're going to start out with moving upstream, the parable of the river. So we're going to have a little story time for just a second. Oops. So in a small town, a group of fishermen gathered down by the river. Not long after they got there, a child came floating down the rapids and calling for help. One of the men quickly dived into the river and pulled the child out. So it's kind of a horrifying picture. Minutes later, another child came, then another and another, and many more children were coming down the river after a while. Soon everyone was jumping in and saving the children, dragging them back onto the shore, and they were trying to save as many children as they could. In the midst of this frenzy, one of the group was seen walking away. Her colleagues were irate. How could she leave when there were so many children to save? After long hours, to everyone's relief, the flow of children stopped, and the group found time to catch their breath. And that moment, their colleague came back and they turned to her and angrily shouted, "How could you walk off when we needed everyone here to save the children?" So she replied, "It occurred to me that someone ought to go upstream and find out where so many kids were falling in the river. What I found was the old bridge had planks missing, and when some children were trying to jump over the gap, they couldn't make it and they fell through the river. So I got someone to fix the bridge. So I want to take a second, and if you could just put in the chat box, why do you think we like to tell people that story? What do you think the significance of that story is? I know you're all on mute, which is why I hear crickets, but I know your brains are thinking. Jen, do we have any chats?
Yeah, so let me move back up here. So inspire people to look at the big picture, be careful about judging people, search for a cause, prevention matters. There's more than one way to help. The root of the problem if we're ever going to have success. The need seems overwhelming when you're faced with the immediate. Identifying root causes is so crucial and can help many more than just individual kids instead overhauling the system. It's easy to focus on what's in front of us, but sometimes the causative factors are harder to see. Fix the bigger problem. Look and see if you can find the root of the problem. Helping individuals is great, but building the bridge helps everyone.
Yes.
These are really good responses, everyone.
Yeah, very good. That's exactly it. So at no point, so I am a social worker by education and trade. I am what they call a macro social worker, which nobody really understands. And I work upstream, and I see the value in all the people that are working with kids currently in crisis. Like those people, at no point did the people who were currently fishing the kids out of the river need to stop. Right? Like those kids still really need to get out of the river. We need to save the ones that are in the water. But we also need to be going upstream and stopping. So we need to be working together. The people who are supporting families and people trying to strengthen families to prevent child abuse from happening in the first place. So that's kind of the way we see the world. We see the trust fund and our allies, we see our role in this way in strengthening families, but it's also really important to have people on the ground doing both things. When we first started telling this story, we didn't have it all out on this PowerPoint like this, and we used to just tell it, and I always said babies, and people absolutely hated the visual of babies in the river. So we switched it to children. But when I first was training, I heard babies, and it was just sort of intentionally horrifying because you're like, babies in the river. Anyway, all right, let's talk about acing the ACEs. Let's talk about the adverse childhood experiences. And before I do that, Annie and Jennifer, did you figure out how to do a poll? Because I have a polling question for the group. And that is, how much do you know about adverse childhood experiences currently? 1 being nothing, you've never heard of them. 2, just a little bit. You may have heard of them once or twice, but you don't remember much. 3, you're pretty familiar. And 4, you could be teaching this webinar. So I don't know, Jen, if you have the poll.
We didn't do a poll, but
if you give me 60 seconds, I can do it.
the chat's going pretty.
Or we could get a sense of the room just by what we see in the chat.
Okay, seeing lots of 3s, a lot of 3s, some 2s, a few 1s, a lot more 2s coming in. 1, 3, 4.
Oh, we got a 4. Woo.
A 3/4, 3.5.
Okay, so we got some experts, and we have people who have no idea.
Yeah.
All right, so it sounds like we got kind of a mix. So that's good. That's interesting. Those of you who said you were 3 and 4, feel free to chime in with your own perspectives and how you've been talking about ACEs as we go on. And those of you who are 1, like I said before, you can ask as many questions as you want. I mean, we do only have an hour, but you know what I mean. Okay. Okay, so the adverse childhood experiences, I'm just going to go back to this while I talk a little bit about the survey itself. So the aha moment to even start this came out of an obesity clinic all the way back in '85. Dr. Vincent Folletti ran a weight loss clinic, and there's a whole story that you can read about on aces2high.org if you want. But the long and short of it was he noticed that people were relapsing in their success for losing weight, some of his best patients. And when he went and actually interviewed them and asked them to like get to the root of what was going on, he found out that many had been abused, often sexually. And that that was the aha, like, hey, when bad things happen to children, like that can manifest physically. And it turned out much bigger than that. That was just like the catalyst that got his brain thinking, because he started lecturing on that. And he says that he was left off the stage in some cases. And he happened to be at a conference where he was sitting next to an epidemiologist, Dr. Robert Anda, and they were sharing ideas. And Dr. Anda was like, that's exactly what I'm working on. You know, I also had the idea that things that happen in your childhood can have these negative effects on your body. So they came up with a big study where they took 10 adverse childhood experiences, and we'll go over which 10 they are. And they studied almost 18,000 people who were part of the Kaiser Permanente. This is in 95 through 97. The average age of this person was 56. They were mostly white folks. They were all insured, and they were all part of Kaiser Permanente. And they studied them for years. And what they found was that ACEs were incredibly common. It was the #1 thing that sort of shocked them. So we'll go over what those ACEs are. Here's the ACE questionnaire, and there was 10. So they ask it like this, you know, while you were growing up in your first 18 years of life, and they ask you questions to identify these 10 adverse childhood experiences, and they put them in 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. So it's emotional abuse is one of them. Like, did you experience any of these under the age of 18? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, that's 3, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and under the family dysfunction, under the age of 18, did you live with anyone who had been incarcerated? Did you witness your mother being treated violently? Did you live with anyone who had a mental illness? Were your parents divorced? Did you live with anyone who had a substance abuse problem? So those are the 10. Now, I think we all know that there's actually a lot more than 10 adverse childhood experiences, but those were the 10 of this particular study. And what they found was that they were incredibly common even among, you know, middle class, well-insured people. If you look at this, 11% said they were emotionally abused. 21% report of those 18,000 people reported being sexually abused. 28% reported being physically abused. And you can see some of these numbers. 11% had an incarcerated relative. 20% lived with someone who had a mental illness. 23% parental divorce. So you see all this breakdown. So to go back to this questionnaire, there is a questionnaire, so you can take the ACEs if you want to. I do not give this out willy-nilly because I feel like it can be triggering and stressful for people just to think about their ACE score, and I don't give it out unless I think that you can have a rather robust conversation about protective factors, which we're having here. So if you were adding yours up in your head just now, which I think everybody does when you have this conversation, we are going to be talking about resilience. But I wouldn't, just because it's out there, I wouldn't, like, for example, I wouldn't give it to your staff members to have them take the ACEs test unless you're going to have a pretty robust conversation about resilience and protective factors. Otherwise, it just stresses people out. And you're about to find out why it can be stressful. So the other thing is, 1, ACEs are really common. 2, ACEs have a dosage effect on negative behaviors and negative physical conditions, or I'm not losing, let me just quote some of these then. So I have to take a second to move my own face. This is why it's a problem that it's in edit mode, because I can't read the slide with my face there. Okay. So for example, adults with an ACE score of 4 or more were 460% more likely to be suffering from depression. The likelihood of adult suicide attempts increased 30-fold or 3,000% with an ACE score of 7 or more. So if they had 7, if they answered yes to those 7 things out of the 10 that I showed you, childhood and adolescent suicide attempts increased 51-fold with an ACE score of 7 or more. So an epidemiologist would say these are hugely significant, and there's a dosage effect in the sense that the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have some of these adverse effects. So if you look at this is really hard to see, and I apologize. If you have an ACE score of 0, some of these things, so let me point out some common ones. This little yellow dot is alcoholism. This green dot is depression. This light green dot is smoking. So that's an ACE score of 0. You see everyone's got a small chance of having those things. By the time you get up to an ACE score of 4, look at the significance, how likely you are to have depression goes way up, and smoking. So you'll see there's behavioral aspects as too. One of the more interesting things about the ACEs study is it probably makes some sense to you that, oh, well, like there's COPDs on here somewhere. So it's this beige one. So yeah, if you're more likely to, you know, if you had a stressful childhood, yeah, you're more likely to smoke. That's a coping mechanism, and you're more likely to have COPD or lung cancer. But what they also found was that when they controlled for that behavior, I'm going to put this back. When they controlled for that behavior, you were still more likely to have COPD. You were still more likely to get lung cancer, even without the smoking, which indicated that trauma affects you on a cellular level. It affects you biologically. Okay. So here's some more interesting things about ACEs. For people with 4 or more seems to be that level where your chances of having some negative outcomes really goes up. 14 times the number of suicide attempts, 3 times the level of lung disease and smoking, 4.5 times more likely to develop depression. And people with 6 or more actually can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. So on average, their lifespan is literally 20 years younger. So this was a big wow. And from a public health perspective, this quote over here, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. So here's some of the, if you just look at this, I'll read this out to you. So it says, adverse childhood experiences lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of risk behaviors, disease, disability, social problems, and early death. And this is along the lifespan. So adverse childhood experiences don't stop at childhood. They follow you well into the rest of your life, for the rest of your life. And that was a big aha. And the good thing about it is it got us talking in certain ways. So Dr. Anda, the epidemiologist that was working with Folletti that started this, says the memory of our experiences is stored in our bodies. And now, so that was kind of the beginning, but ACEs had its, you know, it's not a panacea for figuring everything out. It can be a tool for looking at populations. You know, if we know this neighborhood is high in these certain ACEs, we can identify vulnerabilities that exist in populations, whether that be a geographic or whether, you know, it be racial or whatever subset of the population, if they have this kind of ACEs, they're more likely, we can look for these kind of physical problems. We can try to predict some of that stuff. It also can be a tool in an individual for understanding, for that trauma-informed approach, understanding a person's ACE score, just to see where they're coming from and to understand, you know, some of these struggles they might have. Like if you have a high ACE score, you know, your body is really wired for survival. It's more easy for you to be triggered into fight or flight. And if you know that about yourself, you know, you can be kind to yourself. And you know, hopefully if you look at it from a strengths-based way, this can be a tool for you to help you understand yourself and also build your resilience because you know certain things. So when we talk about the pair of ACEs, we talk about adverse childhood experiences, which I just mentioned, but also adverse childhood environments. And so now we have a broader understanding of ACEs. It's not just about your experiences, it's also about the environments and how the environments feed the experiences. Like, for example, poverty, discrimination, community disruption, violence, poor quality housing and affordability, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital. So we know that people that live on the margins, it's harder for them to, you know, access the resources that will build their resilience. They can be more vulnerable to the experiences, not to mention the added stress that poverty and discrimination give to someone that's already having stress because of these other ACEs. And I really want you to think about the adverse childhood experiences and environments, because we're going to flip it and talk about positive experiences and positive environments. And when I talk about libraries, I'm not going to bury the lead. I see libraries as being definitely a part of a positive environment, that a community level protective factor. All right, I just wanted to, you guys on the webinar with me right now, you are serving our communities. So I wanted to give you a little snapshot about what Idaho specific ACEs we're finding, what data we have in Idaho. So in Idaho, nearly 51% of Idaho children ages 0 to 17 have at least one ACE, which is significantly higher than the national average of 46%. So most of you probably can safely say that most of the children you see are going to have at least one. Children 5 and under in Idaho have experienced ACEs at a higher level than the national average, 38.5 versus 35. So this is, if you look at this map, it's actually this map is flipped because the darker is the better. Here I have a better one. Here we go. ACEs score for Idaho. So look, the blue is Idaho and the red is the United States. Sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy. So 52.6% has 0. So that kind of doesn't. All right, look, if we look over here, the 4+, we have 6.9%. It's higher than the United States for having 4 or more. And if you remember 4 or more, that's where you really start noticing a big jump in some struggles physically and behaviorally. All right, Idaho kids are higher than the US in all but one category. So I know these are kind of hard to see. Let me point out we are significantly higher than the national, so the yellow is the national average, the green is Idaho. And harder to get by on families' income, cannot afford basics. So we're significantly higher there. This is parent or guardian divorced or separated. That's we're about on par with the national average. Parent or guardian died. Parent or guardian served time in jail. We're a little higher. Witness domestic violence. We're about on average there. Victim or witness of neighborhood violence. We're significantly higher here. Lived with someone who is mentally ill, suicidal, or severely depressed. Look, there's a pretty significant difference here. And lived with someone who had a problem with alcohol or drugs. Treated or judged unfairly because of his or her race or ethnic group. We're smaller on that one than average, but I would ask a person of color if what their own experiences with that would be. So I will say we don't, the reason this isn't exactly what the 10 ACEs questionnaire is because we haven't been surveying our population with those 10 questions yet. We just did recently, and we don't have that data yet. So our data is a little off right now until we have something called the BRFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and the BRFIS for 2019 included the 10 questions. They've done it, and we have raw data that we just don't have access to yet. So once we get that data, we should actually have a better picture of Idaho. So this was just taken from source here and there, and so it's not perfectly consistent. We do need better data, but this gives us a little bit of an idea of what we're working with in Idaho. All right, I'm gonna stop there. Does anyone have questions before we sort of transition over to protective factors about ACEs? Anything popping up on the chat?
We haven't really had anything so far. Every time I've interacted with ACEs, I really wish they would change the wording to lived with someone with untreated mental illness. Yeah, the wording on that, because it stigmatizes people with mental illnesses.
I completely agree. I definitely believe in person first language. Yeah, we'll have to get them to change the wording, and I'll have to be better about wording myself because I do in general completely believe with in that as someone who has lived with someone struggling with mental illness myself. That is one of my ACEs. So I agree with you.
And the questionnaire that you referenced, did it also include community experiences?
If you're talking about the
BRFIS? Yeah.
I think the BRFIS just had really those 10 ACE questions on it, and they were worded specifically so you could ask them over the phone. So they changed the wording, but it was basically the same questions.
Is there a place to find ACEs for different states?
The ACE, yes. So a lot of states started including the ACEs questions in their BRFIS. I will say one of the best examples of a state that got that data and then processed it really well and broke it down really well is Alaska. We like it so much, we were going to use their the company they use to synthesize the data, and they've created a little report. So you probably could find that. I mean, it would be a Google search, but I know a lot of states are collecting this information.
Has the ACEs questionnaire been updated to include the community factors?
So what you have is the original ACE questionnaire, those 10. And then you also have people who are really having a lot of discussions about broadening it to include community things. There are surveys that are after the same thing to evaluate your level of adverse childhood experiences that are much more comprehensive than the 10. But because the 10 is so straightforward, it's still sort of a favorite tool. But the conversation is absolutely out there to have bigger conversations, to you know, and to do more comprehensive assessments of people, especially if it's your social worker and you're working with families.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the BRFS and maybe spell it for us?
BRFS is BRFSS, so that's Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which I always thought was kind of redundant. And it is given once a year. I believe they do random calling. I'm not really sure on the methodology, but all the states do it. They randomly call people and ask these questions to get a kind of a sense of the mental and behavioral health of a given state. Anything else?
Just one more. Is there a more comprehensive ACEs questionnaire you find reliable that you could give as a reference?
I do not have the answer to that question. I can tell you that there is also a resilience questionnaire. There's the ACEs questionnaire and then the resilience questionnaire, and you can both find them on the website aces2high.org. And they'll have both, and you can Google resilience questionnaire. And generally, if you're going to give the ACEs, you also give the resilience questionnaire. I've done both before, and occasionally you get someone who is high on ACEs and low on resilience. So they'll say that, you know, as you're having a discussion. And the answer I had for that woman was like, you are sitting right here learning about stuff. You help people for a living. You're clearly very resilient. So just because this questionnaire didn't capture it doesn't mean it's not there, because there's something there. You have some chutzpah that this questionnaire is not capturing very well. So all the tools have their limitations, and I'm sorry I don't have one off the top of my head for a more comprehensive one. I can tell you, what's his name? Ben. Okay, Prevent Child Abuse America has a policy guy. Ben Tanzer? I wouldn't go into this much detail, but I know you guys are librarians, so I can actually just give you the name and you'll know what to do with it. I want to say Ben Tanzer, T-A-N-Z-E-R. And he specifically, like, he came to our Strengthening Families Training Institute and did a whole spiel on the limitation of ACEs. So we know they're limited, and people do talk about it. You know, the professionals are talking about the limitations here, and working on building it to be better. But no one's ever come up with something so easy, so there hasn't been a replacement yet. It's just one of those things.
All right, thanks, Taryn.
All right, so let's move forward with, so this is the big pivot we like. So after we give you a bunch of depressing information about how adverse childhood experiences can affect your body in negative ways, it's equally, if not more important, to pivot, and that is that ACEs are not destiny. And that you can promote the protective factors and you can promote positive experiences, and that they can mitigate the effects of ACEs. So I want you to think about, this is not a real statistic because I don't remember what it was, but if it's 60, I think it was like 60% of people with 4 or more ACEs have struggle with depression. So 6 out of 10. So if you evaluate the 4 out of 10 that don't, you'll find that those 4 people had protective factors. And that was what was keeping them from having it. And you kind of see that, you know, not 100% of the time, but in general, people, the risk factors don't become predictive factors because of protective factors or something like that. Like the protective factor sort of puts a break in that. So what you're seeing right now is the protective factors of the Strengthening Families framework. The Strengthening Families approach came out of this Center for the Study of Social Policy, cssp.org, and we've been using it for years. We basically feel like our overall theory of change for preventing child abuse is to strengthen families from within and without. by fostering these 5 protective factors. So it's parental resilience, social connections, knowledge of parenting and child development, concrete support in times of need, social and emotional competence of children. And because we only have 18 minutes, I'm not going to talk too much about the Youth Thrive, but I will say, so strengthening families is a 2-generation approach. So you're going to, you know, children aren't responsible for their own maltreatment. So you need to work with parents and children together. And the Youth Thrive, just if you're interested for your own library and getting some of these resources, Youth Thrive is for older children who can start to take ownership over some of their own protective factors. Generally like 7 and over, 10 or over. So we're going to go by each one of these, and I'm going to briefly define it. I'm not going to have a big discussion on each one because I want to talk more about specifically how you can implement them in your libraries. What's predictable is preventable. Dr. Robert Anda said that. So there's a lot of power, and if you can predict something, you can prevent it. If we know that people with high ACE scores are more likely to get cancer, we can know that we can stop that. And the mechanism all has to do with the way stress, the effects that stress have on our body, that wear and tear effect that stress has on our body. And so we protect people by buffering them from stress. We protect them from stress. Here's those 5 protective factors. I won't go into this because I feel like we're running short on time. So resilience. What does resilience mean to you? So just in the chat box, well, we'll spend a little bit more time on resilience than the other ones because this is an important one. We all hear this word. But if you could give me some examples of what resilience looks like for you. Someone you know is really resilient and why. And give me some examples in the chat.
They put themselves first.
They take care of yourself. You fill your own cup so you can help others. There's that old airplane. You know, on the airplane, you put your mask over your own face before your child's, which I remember as a kid thinking that sounded selfish. But then, you know, if your mom passes out, she can't help you at all, right? So
Yeah.
mom's got to put the mask on.
They are adaptable. My father-in-law, who broke the cycle of abuse that he grew up with. We have someone who commented that folks from the disability community think that it's wrong to put the onus on victims, and linked to a discussion on maybe an alternative way of thinking of resilience. Someone else said can bounce back from a setback, being able to overcome difficult situations, have a toughness, can recover from difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. That bouncing forward can recover. There's usually some flexibility there. You know, we all have resilience. We all have all the protective factors in some measure. Even the families that we're working with, that we're trying to help, the best way is to acknowledge that they have these protective factors already, and then, you know, figure out how to build them so that they have it more. Is there any others, Jen, that we could talk about, or should we move on?
Finding a support system, working on issues, without dismissing their own feelings, working continually to heal yourself.
That's a good segue to the next one. So social connections. Resilience is a good first one, but I believe out of the 5, the other 4 all contribute to resilience. So healthy social connections, safe connections. When you read about this protective factor, you'll read about, you know, people are social animals. They need to feel connected to each other. That's why COVID's so difficult. We are pack animals, and we need that connection in general. Not everyone's different, but in general, even like introverted people need some level of connection. Those like 1 or 2 people that they're people. We all have our own like people. And you need these sustaining, safe, you know, that unconditional positive regard from other people. So that's really, social connections, I think, is one of the protective factors that comes up the most when I do grants and our programming, and I bet even at the libraries that fostering social connections, that mothers group, where you had story time and you let the babies crawl everywhere and there's new moms and they start talking to each other, then they swap phone numbers and they text. You know, there's incredible power in that. And that was fostered by a library who just gave people the opportunity to build these. I'm going to keep going through them, Jen, but please, if there's anything you want to, if anyone adds, we can go back to one. I just want to be respectful of our time. Knowledge of parenting and child development. So knowledge of parenting and child development. Why is this one of the protective factors to strengthen families and prevent child maltreatment? Well, because when you know the different stages of children's development, when you know what to expect, you take things less personally. And this I speak from personal experience as a mom. When I remember reading like brain rules for babies. And you know, just some of that stuff about tantrums and how children don't have developed nervous systems, so they can't self-regulate. So you need to help them you have to co-regulate. So you just look at a child throwing a fit and you're like, they can't help it right now. This is not them not liking me. My baby doesn't hate me. they're a toddler and they can't self-regulate. So it's my job to co-regulate. I mean, just that, it's helpful. You know, it builds your resilience as a parent. Feel free to comment on any of these, and Jen can chime in. I'm just going to keep going through them because we're going to talk about them specifically with libraries too. So concrete supports in times of need. This is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like people need their physiological needs met. A roof over their head, they need food in their bellies, they need water, they need to feel safe. That's really important. So anything we can do right now, so I've been talking about what we can do for families amid COVID-19, and families who don't have their basic needs met are going to be really stressed out. So anything that the community can do to meet these needs, so the food bank and any housing stability we can offer, so that's one less thing they have to worry about, is not being evicted. Then they have a little bit more bandwidth to do other things, to connect to their child, because that's not going to happen until they get these needs met. Because everyone has limited bandwidth, and this is your body and your brain are wired to take care of these things first. So we also talk about concrete supports. We talk about having access to healthcare, transportation. These are the things that keep us running, keep us going to their job. You know, keep getting an income coming in. Even internet would be a concrete support, right? Because people have been trying to file for unemployment, but you have to do it online. So people, you know, and with libraries shut down, that was really, libraries are like the one place that people get internet who don't have internet, right? So it's a really important concrete support. Social emotional competence, this is the fifth one. And we usually talk about this in terms of social emotional competence in children. So let's just take a minute and tell me what you think a person with high social emotional competence looks like versus someone with low social emotional competence. So give me some examples on that in the chat, please.
They're self-aware, able to regulate their own emotions. With people with high social emotional competence are more empathetic.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So people who can, a lot of it is about being able to identify emotions, which is why this picture is on there. So teaching this to children is teaching them to identify what they're feeling and to help them learn tricks to regulate themselves. So a child with high emotional competence can regulate their feeling, and they work well with other people. They learn to read other people and respond they have higher degrees of empathy. Anything else, Jen?
They're more optimistic. They can read another person's energy and recognize when someone is struggling.
Yeah, very good. So that's important. So this is a protective factor because I always say, now why do you think this could prevent child maltreatment? And it's because children with high social emotional competence are better at getting their needs met. Unfortunately, children who are low in this area are more likely to be abused and neglected. They don't always know how to ask for what they need. They're not always, I hate using the word easy, but they can be more challenging to parent, more challenging to teach, because they're, they haven't been taught to regulate. So, and this is a really important skill. So children who are low in this skill, honestly, that's what you need to focus on. And schools are really getting on board with this. Schools are doing a lot more teaching of these skills because it's so important to survive in the real world. I don't really like that expression either. It's so important for survival to have some of these skills, and you just struggle less, I believe. All right, so putting the protective factors to work. Now we only have 6 minutes, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to kind of gloss over these. We just talk about kids who have high ACEs can be more challenging to teach and to parent, more externalizing behaviors, fewer positive responses. Everyone wants to be loved, and kids with childhood trauma, that's not always how they respond to you. They can respond aggressively or angrily. So we hope that when you understand about ACEs and the protective factors, that you can get more of that trauma-informed mindset and really start thinking about what happened to them and where they're coming from, and understand how trauma impacts development, including the need for extra nurturing. And you can reframe some of that behavior. So we have kind of the different reframing of behavior. The non-trauma informed way of looking at things is anger management problems. They're willful, naughty, uncontrollable, manipulative, pushing buttons, in need of punitive consequences. But being more trauma informed, you see that child's actually just emotionally dysregulated. They're scared. They're in perpetual fight, flight, or freeze mode. And that's why they're acting out, or that's why they're staring out the window when they should be listening to you. They're just, all these behaviors are adaptive, adapting coping patterns. Every behavior is adaptive, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, it's adaptive. Seeking to get needs met the only way that he or she knows how. They lack positive coping and self-regulation skills, or they're acting from a negative worldview, learned helplessness. So let's spend our last 5 minutes. My spiel is that I believe libraries have a dual role in prevention. One, that you are a community level protective factor. So if you flipped that tree, the two types of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences and adverse childhood environments, if you flipped it to be positive childhood environments, part of that environment would be a community with libraries. You provide positive experiences and resources, the internet, like we talked to concrete supports, books, games, referrals to other agencies. You talk to people, you have a sense of who's in your community and what they need, and you'll probably have brochures that you hand to people. So you have that going. You also have an opportunity to build your additional protective factors. So for 4 minutes, if you could give me some examples of what you're currently doing on any of these 5. What are you currently doing to foster parental resilience, social connections, knowledge of parenting and child development, concrete supports, social and emotional competence of children? Let's just take a few examples for 2 minutes, and then for the last 2 minutes, we're going to talk about what we could be adding to that.
So Pat added programs, and lots of different types of programs can help build social connections, just sort of depending on what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being more aware of the needs of vulnerable populations. And I think librarians definitely have a higher degree of awareness of vulnerable populations.
Mm-hmm.
Hosting teen get-togethers, parties, and programs.
Yep, lots of fostering social connections there. Anytime you have any programmings, you're bringing people together.
Trying to include books and songs related to different emotions during story time.
That's excellent. Jennifer put out, remember, she put out book lists for each of the 5 protective factors. So if you didn't get that, you should get in touch with Jennifer. And she came up with lists for each protective factor. So you could have like social emotional competence week.
Not only are there lists, there's story time outlines. So
yeah, there's story time outlines. Yeah, she
think
spent a lot
about
of
what
time
you're
on
going to
that.
do.
Mm-hmm.
I just put the link in the chat, but they're there if you need them.
There you go.
So other things, book clubs for children and young adults. The library is a safe space. I'm missing a few here, I'm sure. Offering computer access and curbside service when we can, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Ryan Dowd's homeless training. That's a big one that a lot of libraries have gone through.
Yes.
Did I say offering a safe space?
You did. You did. So absolutely, like really high. You guys are really high in your concrete supports. You know, you offer books. You have offered. I think you have like STEM toolkits that you can pick up at libraries, right, Jennifer?
Some libraries, yeah.
Some libraries have these like little STEM kits and kindergarten preparedness materials, all sorts of things. So we only have a minute left and I want to be respectful of your time. Does anyone have any ideas for something they could do? So they could implement something new that you're not doing?
And I just wanted to chime in here really quickly that one of the reasons that I really wanted to make sure that we were doing these trauma-informed webinars now is that I've been really inspired by how many of you are reconnecting with your communities in virtual spaces. So many of you have, just dove into doing virtual story times or virtual chats in your community, book clubs through your Facebook page or through Zoom. And it really made me think about how you could leverage those platforms that you're building right now to address some of the issues that families in your community are facing. Even if it's just like a 15-minute parenting class over Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of options for partnering too, so you don't have to, please don't feel like you need to be the person addressing all of the ACEs in your community. Taryn's organization, like she said, has 30 trainers around the state who are available for help. And I know there's many other organizations in our communities that we could partner with to find creative ways to address ACEs. So I will go back to the chat and see what you were saying. Let's talk about hotspots. I really want, Runa said I really want to start a parent circle in the library for parents to openly discuss concerns and get feedback from other parents and also early childhood professionals.
That's a really good idea.
Especially when so many parents are maybe at home with their children 24/7 without a break for weeks and weeks on end. They may be running into roadblocks in terms of their own knowledge and skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe you do like little virtual parenting tips for 15 minutes or something. We are at 2:01, so maybe that question is just something you can think about. And I think if you start having these conversations with your staff, intentionally talking about what could we do more to prevent knowledge of parenting and child development? What could we be doing more to prevent parental resilience? So if you frame it in the protective factor framework, maybe that could give you a guide for your ideas. And
join us next week at 2 o'clock or at 1 o'clock on Tuesday. Taryn's colleague, Roger Sherman, will be with us to talk about building positive experiences, and we'll really dig down into how libraries can help build up families in their communities.
All right.
Yay, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to end the recording now.
Yep. Thank you, Taryn.
All right, thank you.